Darkness. It does something to us. When you walk into a dark room, what's the first thing you want to do? Turn on the lights. So, okay, be honest. So for all of you, when you were children, how many of you were afraid of the dark? Or have children that were afraid of the dark? I was. Yeah, there were monsters. There were monsters in every dark place. Under my bed, in the closet. But you know, that was a long time ago, and now we have sophisticated technology to help deal with that. Or, you know, we can use night lights. We can turn the lights on in those dark spaces. And in fact, that is what people have been doing since before we were modern humans. So this is a picture of an archaeological excavation in Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa. And here, archaeologists have found perhaps the first use of controlled fire by our hominin ancestors, Homo erectus. So they were lighting up this dark cave 1.5 million years ago, which means that we have been sitting around fires, dispelling darkness, well, forever. So how did I get interested in darkness? Well, there's a one-word answer: caves. I love caves. I always wanted to go to caves, and my parents wouldn't take me. So when I was a little girl, I drew pictures of caves. So when I grew up and became an archaeologist, I showed everybody. What did I decide to study? Caves. Yeah. So this is a photograph from my first field project. This is a cave in Belize in Central America called Actun Tunichil Mcnall, which means Cave of the Crystal Sepulcher. And this cave was an ancient Maya ritual cave site that was used from about 700 to 900 AD. And I worked here with the Western Belize Regional Cave Project starting about 1996. But I've worked in ancient Maya ritual caves ever since then. Now, why would make my whole career, right, based on ritual cave sites of the ancient Maya? Well, for one thing, these caves contain thousands of artifacts that need to be recorded. And not only this, but they are disappearing at such a rapid rate from looting and also from vandalism. And so the only way to really protect these sites is to record them. So I have spent my life doing just this, because these caves were sacred places for the ancient Maya people, and they deserve to be preserved. They deserve this because for the ancient Maya, these caves were so special. In their mythology, they were considered to be entrances to the underworld. Now, the underworld was sort of an ambiguous place, so different things could come from the underworld, good things and bad things. So there were deities that lived in the underworld. There were good deities, such as Chak, the rain god, who sent clouds out of caves to rain on the crops and create agricultural fertility. Or there were the evil lords of the underworld who sent death and disease and destruction and war to the ancient Maya people. So these spaces were a very good place to go and leave offerings for these deities. So just in case you think that this was a thing of the past, well, it's not, because even today, ancient Maya people still use these caves. And here's an image from Natunich Cave in Guatemala of some traditional Maya people doing a ritual not very long ago, asking for agricultural fertility and success. So what do I mean exactly when I talk about the word cave? What's a cave? We have different ideas about caves. But in my research, I have to differentiate between caves and rock shelters because we do different things in these different spaces based on the quality of light. So in rock shelters, they're nice and light, and they have twilight areas, and you can live in them, and people even sometimes build little cities inside them. But deep, dark caves, the kind that I call caves, actually have dark zones. Now, in the dark zone, that's a whole different thing. Dark zones are not really very good places to live. And in fact, most people, through time and space, have used these as ritual spaces. So for instance, the Neanderthals, they lived in the rock shelter part of a cave, but they buried their dead in the dark zones. This is an image from the Paleolithic cave in France called Chauvet. This is perhaps one of the earliest cave paintings in the world. And this was placed deep in the dark zone of the cave. And they weren't living back there. And in fact, in the Neolithic period, cave use really expanded when people began to settle down, and we started seeing a lot of ritual cave use, leaving artifacts and offerings in caves, and also using them for ossuaries and cemeteries and all kinds of things. And this goes on and on and on. I could give you hundreds of examples of ritual cave use over time. And so even today, when we think about it, a lot of the great world religions have pilgrimages to caves. We still consider caves sacred. These are very elaborate. Thousands of people go there. People sometimes die going to these pilgrimages, to these ritual, very important sacred sites. To the point that the pattern is so pervasive that I would argue that there's no such thing as the caveman. I know everybody's disappointed about that, but the caveman is a myth. The caveman is something that got started by archaeologists in the mid-1800s and has been perpetuated by popular culture. So if we begin to really understand how these dark zones of caves are used, you have to ask, why caves? What is it that draws us into the cave? So let's start to think about, what is the experience of a cave? Have any of you ever been in a cave? Oh, good, great. Well, you'll relate with this. So when you go in a cave, you usually go into the earth or you go down, right? So that in itself is interesting. And when you get there, what do you see? It doesn't look anything like the surface, right? So caves, you've got stalactites and stalagmites and all these weird-looking formations. You can't really see very far. They're three-dimensional spaces. Sometimes you have to crawl around to get from one place to another. They're what we refer to as illegible. They're difficult to understand and to navigate. But aside from that, what's the first thing you think about when you think about cave? Darkness, right? So they're dark and they're full of shadows. So when I think about ritual cave use, I began to question, well, what could darkness have to do with this? This is probably the number one thing we think of when we think of caves. So could darkness have something to do with this pattern of ritual usage over time and space? So that got me interested in sensory deprivation studies that were done in the mid-1900s, right? So these were done at major universities in the US and Canada to try to understand what happens when you cut off your senses. So what researchers did was they would occlude people's eyes, either totally or with little ping pong balls, so that you could only see shadows, right? But you couldn't see figures or images. Sometimes they would cover their ears. They would sometimes cover their hands so they couldn't feel anything. And then John Lilly invented the flotation tank, so people could also experience like an anti-gravity type experience. And what did these researchers find? Well, first of all, that there's a lot of individual difference. People experience this differently. But the one thing they could all agree on was that when you occlude someone's eyesight for a long enough period of time, anywhere from 15 minutes to a day to maybe a month, right? They begin to hallucinate. And what do they see? Well, they tend to see geometric patterns that tend to vibrate. And by the way, this image is not actually vibrating, it's you. But they also noticed some other things as well, and that is that there was differences in feelings. And John Lilly actually began to suggest that there was also ways in differences in the way people think, And I thought, well, this is kind of interesting. I'd like to know more about this. I would like to know whether it's total sensory deprivation that causes this, or could low-light conditions, such as what we might experience if we're walking through a cave with a torch or a flashlight, or maybe even a little candle, could that change the way we think? So, I partnered with some cognitive scientists, and we decided to do a little experiment. So in our experiment, the first thing we did is that they wrote a survey. And our survey was kind of interesting because it gave little scenarios, right? So we had little questions, and in these scenarios, they could have different kind of ambiguous answers. But the one thing that they forced people to do was to try to explain the unexplainable. So this is an example of one of our questions. Imagine your grandpa passed away 1 year ago today, and on the day of his death, you wake up to the scent of his cigar smoke. No one in the house smokes, and the scent is very unique. Would you be more inclined to think, and we gave them 4 choices, A, it was just a coincidence, B, you're just hallucinating, C, God may be letting you know he's all right, or D, it may possibly be a sign from his spirit? Now notice in the first 2 answers, this would require something that we're calling kind of rational, scientific thinking, explained in a way as an everyday occurrence. However, the second 2 answers are what we call imaginary thinking. So for imaginary thinking, you have to invoke some sort of a deity or a supernatural force in order to explain the unexplainable. Now this is something, this imaginary thinking, is something that anthropologist Maurice Bloch calls the transcendental imaginary. And so for Bloch, this is what separates humans from other species. It's our ability to live in our imaginations. And he gives, for example, human roles. So things like mother, father, uncle, audience, speaker, president. These roles are categories, and we understand them. We know that there's certain things that go with these roles, right? Certain kinds of behaviors that go with them. But this is all essentially in our heads. They don't actually exist. They're things we all agree upon. And so this transcendent imaginary is what makes us human. So back to our experiment. We had 104 students volunteer, and we divided them into 2 groups of 52. And we set the first group in a very lovely, well-lit room with a picture window. And the second group, we put into a dark room with only a little tiny light so that they could see to do the survey. And we were somewhat surprised by our findings. We found that in the light room, people were tended to choose our more rational or scientific kind of explanations. But in the dark room, people were more inclined to use their imaginary thinking and chose C and D. And not only this, but about 11% more in the dark room chose this answer. And when we actually did the statistics on it, it was statistically significant. So I know this is only one small study, but it's prompted us to do a lot more research on that, and we have ongoing research right now. But in 2014, there was an anthropological study that helped to corroborate our findings. So Holley Moyes, an anthropologist who studies the Kalahari Bushmen in Africa, had been writing down conversations for about 20 years. And she had all this really wonderful contextual data about the conversations. And she knew whether they took place in the day or at night. And what did she find? During the day, people wanted to talk about ordinary things. Where are they going to go? What are they going to do? What are they going to eat? Things like this. But at night, it was totally different. Sitting around the fire, what did they do? They sang. They danced. And 80% of the time, they told stories. So there were the Kalahari Bushmen sitting around their fire, living in their imaginary thinking at night in the dark. What does all this mean? What's out there about this? Well, it's not out there, it's in there. When we take the archaeological record, ethnographic studies, research done in different universities, and my own little study, what it suggests is that our environment plays a very important part in not only how we feel, how we think, but also how we interpret our world. In terms of ritual cave use, and remembering that caves are some of the darkest places on Earth, they have perpetual darkness. It suggests that they were not passive players, but active agents in the development and maintenance of spiritual ideas. Although we avoid darkness, it makes us uncomfortable, it frightens us, we also seek it out for very specific reasons. Because darkness frees our minds from the constant barrage of sensory data that demands our attention every minute of every day. Darkness allows us to recreate our world, to think about ourselves in a different way, maybe even create something new. Darkness allows us to transcend the ordinary and perhaps to find the divine within ourselves.